So this video is part of our Insightful Ideas from Smart People series, and in this video we highlight Dan Alpert from Westwood Capital, who wrote a book called The Age of Oversupply, which is probably one of the most insightful books I have read about how the world economy works. The book was written in 2013. I found it very interesting because he really illuminated in a logical way how the world has changed in the last 30 years. Alpert explains how emerging nations becoming a part of the world free market economy created a huge expansion of the global labor force, and these new participants tend to save more than they spend and have thus created an oversupply of capital as well. This has had major implications for developed world countries, and Alpert argues that you cannot understand the challenges facing developed countries without appreciating how the rise of emerging economies has distorted the economies of rich countries. On the labor market, he says, today the world has a market labor force of roughly 3 billion people, many of whom are in a position to compete directly for a wide range of jobs held by workers in the developed world, thanks to multinational corporations, the internet, and other features of a flat world. The fall of the bamboo and iron curtains, along with economic liberalization, has quite literally brought the other half of the world online, doubling the global labor supply in the free market in the past 2 decades. So a huge amount of new labor came onto the market due to rising economies, technologies, and multinational corporations. Everyone is familiar with that nowadays, with outsourcing to other parts of the world and what you can get done online. What happened then is that we ended up with a glut of savings because many of these workers live in countries with insufficient social safety nets or pensions, and they tend to save more than workers in developed countries. Businesses also tend to save more. And so, as Alpert points out, this torrent of global savings flowed back to deficit countries like the US and weaker European countries, which meant that those governments did not need to borrow as much domestic capital, and so interest rates plummeted. And the rate of growth of financial assets has far exceeded the growth of world output of goods and services, and there was not enough productive activity to sop up all the money. And so we have this glut of labor and this glut of savings, and the reason that the enormous ocean of liquidity is not being deployed is that there is so much global supply and excess capacity of labor, plants, equipment, and goods and services relative to the present demand that there is little reason for private sector investment in the development of additional supply. And so this is what Alpert calls a supply-side nightmare scenario. And why is it important? Well, capital superabundance, as Alpert describes it, helps explain why monetary easing by the Fed and other central banks, together with today's record low interest rates, hasn't done much for the economy. It really is a new landscape for policymakers trying to jumpstart growth, reduce unemployment, control the national debt, trade deficits, and currency issues. Alpert argues that monetary policy does not have the bite it once had, and argues for large-scale strategic infrastructure, fiscal stimulus to restart growth and lay the foundation for future prosperity. You can see here what has happened. This is our graph showing declining asset turnover and capacity utilization going back 30 to 40 years. That's very much in line with what Alpert is highlighting. This chart shows capital consumption and new investment as a percent of GDP. You can see capital consumption is stable, but new investment, shown by the red line as a percent of GDP, has been on a long-term decline. And so we had a few key takeaways from Alpert's book. For investors, the impact of extended low interest rates has important implications for valuations. Understanding the challenges for growth in the context of oversupply, that was an eye-opener. We think that changes in consumption patterns of emerging market savers could unleash a wave of consumer demand for goods and services. So when emerging market consumers start to consume more, there is a lot of pent-up demand there that could really boost global growth rates. You have China trying to move from an investment-based to a consumption-based economy, which could be a big driver, but that is like turning a big ship around, so it will take some time. And from a US-based perspective, we think innovation-led export growth, targeting the needs of those emerging market consumers, is where our focus should be. And so I learned a lot from Alpert's book, and I highly recommend reading the whole book. Thanks.